he makes a distinction between belonging together and belonging together. It's actually very useful. Depends where the emphasis is. Let's look at this one first of all. Here, belonging together. The emphasis is on together. What that means is that the together determines the belongingness. So the together, as it were, comes first. It's because things are together that they belong. And so you could come along and you could say, right, I'm going to put these things together. I'm going to together them. And then they will belong, because I have togethered them. So the together here is primary. You together things, and that makes them belong. So you say, come on, I'm going to together you lot. Come on, get in there. Go on, right, now you belong. Now, the other one, belonging together, puts the emphasis on the belonging, says that that's something primary. In this case, the together depends on the belonging. The belonging determines the together. That means that things already belong, and because they belong, they are together. So the belongingness, which is already there in things, determines the together. This is much more natural, much more organic. The second one, the belonging together, is very much what it is with systems theory, where things are togethered, and you've got all your boxes with words in and all your links. You have to get these things on the board. You put all your boxes there with words in, and then you link them all up. You're togethering them. There, now you belong as a whole. You are a whole, because I have togethered you, so you belong. But supposing, in fact, those things actually already have a more subtle way of already belonging together. They already belong together before you together them. In which case, you've missed the belongingness and the way in which they're already there. And so you impose a togetherness on them which is totally alien to their nature. And this is what Heidegger calls the framework and framework thinking. This is a more subtle thing. And this is really what we've been looking at. If you look at this distinction and the difference in relating, the difference in that the things belong together in that they're already related. It's already there. Now what happens is, if you don't notice that, and if your distinction, which is you go downstream into focusing on what is distinguished, then what happens then is that the distinction becomes a separation. And you only notice separation. You don't notice the way in which things are already related. Because you only notice separation, you say, oh, I must connect these things, they're separate, we can't have that. We must connect them. And you introduce a connection which is external to them and which will together them, link them together. So you say, now they belong together because I have togethered them. And this is the external approach of the system, which is actually prioritizes separation. The fundamental presupposition here is that separation is primary, which it is not. Mm-hmm. There's a very subtle distinction Heidegger makes, and I have found it over the years extremely, extremely helpful. I mean, you can see this in human relations. The continual attempt to together things, not notice the way in which there is already a belongingness. I mean, you know, marriage is a prime case in point. I don't know if you're married or whatever it is, but I can tell you that you really learn about this in marriage. Because males, hey, there's no prizes for getting which side males start on, is there? You start togethering everything, and that really, there you go, you learn. So in human relations, this is very, very important. And this is what we're seeing with the clouds, because what happens is that those different clouds, which we may see as separation, they actually belong together. And what Howard picked up was the belongingness. I got a quote which I meant to bring in. It's not far away. It's a quote from Heidegger. See if I can get through the door without causing any damage to these glasses. I can keep speaking if I
That's the scholar's flat?
Yeah, you haven't seen it?
Well, I just don't know which one's which. I've seen them all. Oh, there's only
That's
a
what
thing.
we call the scholar's flat.
Yes. I keep getting visits from people.
That was me.
That's all right.
I'm always peeking through doors and then wishing that.
Oh, we should put a little sign.
Oh, I don't think it matters. Everyone knows that I'm through there. I think with one or two of the other types wandering in from time to time, I've been sitting there and people have wandered in. Oh.
Do not enter.
Now, Heidegger says this in Being and Time. Explication can draw... Oh, Heidegger's language is always difficult. This is the Stambo translation. It's better than the other one. So, explication can draw the conceptuality belonging to the being to be unfolded from the being itself, or can force it into concepts to which that being, according to its manner of being, is opposed. It actually says a lot when you get into it. It's saying that conceptuality means the concept, the ideas that you develop, can actually be drawn, can belong to the being itself, which will be unfolded in those concepts. So you can find the form of thinking which is appropriate to the phenomenon itself. Or you can try to force that phenomenon into concepts which you have brought, which are alien to its own nature. Well, again, you can see that with Howard. And you can see that here with these two here. When you find the right conceptuality belonging to the being to be unfolded from the being itself, because this refers back to the point that you made, then that is belonging together. You found their belongingness. You found the belongingness in things. When you actually force it into concepts to which that being, according to its manner of being, is opposed, then you make it belong together. You together it, and that, as far as I'm concerned, is very, very much what happens in systems thinking.
Henri, can I ask you a question? Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, go on.
Let's go.
Yeah, and I have one question. You told that, if I understood right, you told that the belonging together is more natural, and the belonging together is like more that they are together, and then you create a connection. In my view, at first sight, it seems it would be different, like belonging together, like they are together, so they create a connection and they start belonging. In the first one, belonging together, it seems to me that they are forced to be together because somewhere, somebody or something decided that they belong. It's kind of an imposition. It seems to me that the first one is less natural than the second.
Oh, that's very interesting. You see it the opposite way around. To mean the opposite way around to Heidegger. But that's fine. I mean, there's nothing I can do about that. I just see. I just comment on the word natural. I think I did say that word. I think, and I shouldn't have done. What I would prefer to say is that one is more subtle. One is subtle, and the other is coarse. I like the distinction between subtle and coarse. But following Heidegger, I see the belonging together as being the subtle one, and the second one, the belonging together, as being coarse. And you see it the other way around,
Yeah.
which is very interesting.
That could be just a syntactical issue. I mean, it could be that the syntax in the language you're most comfortable with is different, and syntax being order, how words are ordered.
No, it's more like a strong word.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The strong
Yeah,
word
but
comes
like-
first maybe in English, and the strong word comes second.
But like belonging being the strongest one.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's belonging being the strongest one seems like obligation, and together being the strongest one seems that they are together and kind of they created a connection. You see what I mean?
That's actually very interesting. No, that is very interesting. I mean, I can see what you're saying, and I think I can see, I can see from what you're saying that there would be situations which might be better described that way. But I'm just not using it that way.
Roland gave the example of a plant and a clock. So I don't know if that's your example. But
No, I haven't really talked about plant and a clock.
no, so he said a clock, all the parts are brought together, and that's why the
Oh, sorry, yes, I got you now. Roland, sorry. Yes.
Yeah. So they're together, and that's how the watch works. But in a plant, the leaf and the stem and the flower, you can only imagine them. You can't. They don't have any existence except in their belonging as a plant, as a whole plant.
That's interesting. Yes. I was also thinking, following on from that, about what I did yesterday about the whole and the part. That when you get the counterfeit whole of the system, you try to bring the parts together. You try to connect them together. Whereas when you see that the whole presence is within the parts, you see each part is itself an expression of the whole, and that the whole can only be the whole because of the part, and the part because of the whole. Then you see that the parts, there's a deeper kind of, but for me, a deeper kind of belonging together. Now, you might say, therefore, that no, for you, that means that they're together. That's okay. I can see you could turn it around. I think in a way, I quite take your syntactic point, because you could turn it around the other way. Someone could do, yes. I can see that. I hadn't thought of this before, because I simply followed Heidegger, and I've used this quite a lot. It's been quite lively for me. But I can see that you could turn it around the other way. So perhaps this is... at this point, I'm very pleased that I've only put this in this time as a footnote, not in the main text, because there's obviously is room for turning them round here. I think in terms of the whole and the part, I mean, it's just that I think it was just that always. So I first came across this a long time ago, and I didn't think of it in terms of what I'm doing now, but I've always had this obsession. Well, not now, but I did have this obsession that systems. There was something deeply wrong about systems theory, and in a way, I think it coloured my whole attitude for quite a long time. I don't think about it now, because I've moved on. But I think it did cover my attitude and the way in which I use terms and so on that. And for me, it was quite easy to see that what people were doing with systems thinking was trying to tie things together. And I had this sense, but there may be ways in which things belong, which are therefore covered over. I felt this very strongly in personal life. I think I felt this with relations in human organizations. And I did feel that all the people who came in, all the people with their diagrams and their grids and all their management tools and their personality tools and so on and that, were doing something that was very coarse. And there was something more subtle there. Subtle just means refined. It doesn't mean clever. Subtle just means refined. You get the sense of what subtle means. And and they were just obliterating this with their approach. So that's kind of my way of interpreting it, and that...
No, I see.
You see what that's how I got it.
Yeah.
what you've said has been for me very interesting to see that actually you could switch these round, and there are circumstances, because I think what you're saying is, if I've got this right, is that something quite new could emerge. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that I see that now, what you're saying. And if you focus on the belonging, then that could actually stop something new from emerging.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying, isn't it? Yes. Thank you very much. That's extremely interesting. Yes, that is interesting. So, yes. Well, it's also, I think we've sorted it out, but
No, I see it both ways.
both ways now. Yes, I also see it both ways. That's very, very good.
That's my question, which is, can you go from one to the other? For example, if thinking of Gaia, if you looked at the interrelationship between phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon, and you've made a model of that, that's on the belonging together side of things. You know, you've got a systems model.
Yeah.
In my experience, that systems model, if you use it in the right way, can bring you into the other side, into the belonging together.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have got that kind of belonging together if you hadn't had the system model to begin with.
Right.
Because you couldn't possibly have seen it all.
Right.
Because it's, you know, the Earth is on such a large scale. Some of
Yes.
these cycles are happening very slowly, they're invisible. So I think there's a way of bringing these together, so you in consciousness, so you know what you're doing. You made the system, but you're doing it in order to get to this more subtle form of.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting indeed. I can see that could be the case, and that. But what you're doing, therefore, is that your more systems approach, the belonging together, is not dogmatic.
That's right.
It's a constructive conception.
Right, and you know what you're doing. You're aware of it.
This is the key thing.
You're aware, and so there's a feedback between the two. They can inform each other. The better I'm able to get into the belonging together, the better my systems model is going to be. The more correct it's going to be, and then that will inspire my belonging together. So you can do a kind of feedback.
Right, this is lovely.
Between the two, and they amplify each other. I think of this particularly in relation to Gaia.
Right.
I mean, I'm glad you like this, because this is how I work with Gaia. If you'd said it's a load of rubbish, then 20 years of work would have been shot down in flames. And I'm glad I've never dared to tell you this before, you see.
It would be a reciprocal relationship, all that balance.
Yeah, there would be yeah.
Now, I do find that very fascinating, because funnily enough, over the last few years, I haven't been able to do anything about it, I've got more interested in this dynamical interweaving of things. I mean, I found it in the later Merleau-Ponty, and then I realised it was in the whole of the part and other things and so on like that. And I sort of think that's why I got so keen on the whole and the part, the reciprocation again, because I think there's something very fundamental here. And I think that what you just said is an example of that. And that is actually the way we do work when things come alive.
Right.
And I think, I mean, that's what you've just said. I think is wonderful, because I hadn't never thought of that at all. I mean, this is marvellous, because in a way I'm stuck in my ways, because I've only got myself to talk to, and I'm very convincing with myself, you know. So I mean, that's very illuminating, and this is very illuminating for me. It is interesting. You can't help but get stuck if you're working on your own. You can't help it. But what came across there was that it's not a dogmatic enunciation, which is what you get in systems thinking.
That's
It's
right.
dogmatic enunciation. What you're working with is what I would call a constructive conception. Now, a constructive conception, the idea of a constructive conception, is that it's not the truth. A dogmatic enunciation says it's the truth. It isn't, but it says it is. A constructive conception has in it sufficient truth for it to be useful to take you on. And I think this distinction, introduced to me quite some time ago, is very, very valuable indeed. And your key thing you said there was you're aware that you're doing this. That needs to be underlined in red many, many times. It's the most important thing of all. You're aware that you're doing it. That's how things should be done. You do them in full awareness of what you're doing. Now, our problem is that we don't. We do things without being aware of what we're doing. And that's when it becomes dogmatic. That's when we get trapped in it. I've always... I used to upset some people by saying, well, in physics, you know, people hate the idea, and of course, the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, in which you show all this colour, everything out, and you focus only on the mathematical qualities. And this, of course, we all see is barbaric and it's caused so much trouble. But the only reason it's caused trouble is because people are not aware of what they're doing. And what if you go through and you see how this came in historically, how it was introduced and what it does. I remember once here saying, and Geordie went mad, because it annoyed me because he was so much against mainstream science, and he was irritating me, as you know. And I said one day, well, there is a way in which you can actually accept primary and secondary qualities distinction, and it's okay. And of course he began to get very annoyed. But there is a way in which you can do that. You can do it when you see what you're doing. And then you don't make dogmatic statements about it, nor do you think that what you've discovered is the ultimate truth about the universe, and you've shown that there's no colour in the universe, there's no sound, there's no smell and so on. You don't for one moment think you've done that. What happened with that is a methodological distinction to enable you to take the mathematical approach was wrongly ontologized. That's what happens when you don't realise what you're doing. So what you said there is the key to everything. You can do all sorts of reductionist things, and they can be jolly useful, but you need to be aware when you're doing it that that is what you're doing, because then you won't turn that into something dogmatic and say this is the truth. Is this clear to everyone? Because actually this is a really, really, really important point. And everybody falls down on this. The mainstream scientists and so on and that, the ones you don't like, they fall down on it. And the holistic people, they fall down on this as well. Everyone falls down on this. And it's the key. You have to do science or thinking consciously. That means being aware of what you're doing. Yes.
Well, I'm going to throw this out as maybe a bigger topic, but because I've been really fascinated with and challenged by and struggling with some of the material that Ken Wilbur has put out in terms of the four-quadrant model and how he's worked with that, in terms of by pointing to it and creating a distinction, he's wanted to create a sense of integral and the whole, but where it's moved to seems to have become a dogma in terms of separating and not being able to hold the sense of the difference and relatedness, and so the integration to me has gotten lost. In fact, I've challenged some of that recently.
How do you mean you challenged it?
Well, I wrote a book review on one of the recent books and said I don't see the integral in the integral ecology. So, I'm just curious as to, I guess my question is that from what Wilber did, is it what people who followed the thinking and then moved to dogma because they weren't seeing the whole in the parts that he created. So I guess it's just it's a big, but I'm just observing what you're saying and feeding it through that awareness and going, I'm curious as to how that's all happened. So it's running in my mind. So anything you might have to say on that would be great.
There's a natural process which is linked to this whole business about the natural process is to go downstream. It can't be avoided. It just cannot be avoided. I mean, if it were avoided, we wouldn't experience at all. It would cease to be. It's the whole process of experiencing. To see what you see. You see that. So when you see that, you are not aware of the seeing that. And we're going into this later. So the whole nature of things is to go downstream. And that means in the case of distinctions, when you go downstream, the whole nature of things is to become fixed on what is distinguished. And that means things begin to seem separate. They can't avoid it. The only way you can avoid it is to regain flexibility by trying to go back upstream from the end into the coming into being. And it's very difficult, once things have got fixed, it's very, very hard to do. And anyone who's working, this will happen to their work. And this has happened to Ken Wilbur. And I mean, I think when he was at an earlier stage, then his work would have been very alive, very. I don't know that much about it, though I have read the history book, what's it called, History of Everything, and I have actually read Sex, Ecology and Spirituality. Yeah. But that's the only works of his I've read. And I noticed there's many, many more works, and I could imagine that they're becoming a bit more fixed as inevitable and so on as time goes on. And then as more and more people pick it up, they will emphasise the separateness and dogmatise it, and it becomes a cult. This is what happens in life, and it always does. It happens with religions, it happens with everything. It can't be avoided, actually. All you can do is you can be aware of it. And there comes a certain point with something where it's no longer possible to revivify it. That does happen. That happens with religion, for example, when it's no longer possible to revivify it. People try all sorts of things, but it's too late. And what that was about is then lost, and people latch on to secondary things, and they turn them into something as if that was the primary thing. Yeah. And then hundreds of years of confusion follow. This is serious stuff, and people's lives on a bit grander scale are ruined by this kind of thing. We can live our whole lives under an illusion of a dogma, not seeing how that arose. It's actually serious stuff. But fortunately here we're dealing with something a bit simpler. But I certainly take your point about someone like Ken Wilbur.
Well, the original distinguishing seemed to be really important to give people a sense of the integral, and then people got focused on the parts, and they lost the whole. Yes. But now they're still saying that they're holding onto the whole, that it's lost, and it's like it's just watching that happen, and this watching Ken go with it as well.
You think he's going with this? He's got lost too. Yes, I think there's also the danger, of course, which is another good reason for not getting involved. Self-justification coming up. I don't get involved. I get my own fixation, but I don't get caught up. See, if you're giving a lot of talks and things to people, you're continually having to formulate. Because in giving a talk, you formulate. And then you get stuck in those formulations. And it's the same with words. You use certain terms, which have a meaning and aliveness at first. Then people start repeating the terms back as if they're just counters in a kind of game, you know, and there's no meaning in it anymore. But it seems to me to be what happens. So I mean I get fixed because I'm on my own, so I get stuck. But someone who's really out there doing things, he or she is going to get stuck as well because they're doing so much out there in the world. Whatever you do, you're going to get that problem. But yeah, I mean, I did think there was some terrific stuff in sex, ecology, spirituality, and I thought that the way he distinguished between the whole and the all and the one and so on. The all, I can't remember now. The one. It was very, very good. He really brought out how limited a lot of holistic thinking was. And I thought it was absolutely spot on. I thought it was very good. Yeah, but you become somebody, don't you? Then it's a great thing to avoid becoming somebody.
Henry, one thing I've often wondered is whether Descartes himself ontologized reductionism, or whether he just used it as a kind of tool, and whether future generations ontologize it.
I will be talking about Descartes in Passou. I'm very keen on Descartes. I said, and you know, I've mentioned this before. I mean, people project onto Descartes all sorts of things which have nothing to do with him. And I will be mentioning some things, and I'll try to mention a bit more about Descartes later. I mean, but he's a very good example, and it happens a lot with philosophers, of how things go wrong. Particularly with how people take what a philosopher's done, how they take it on, can very often, and many times is, completely contrary to what that philosopher was trying to do. This happens enormously with Husserl, for example. It happened with Descartes too. I mean, there are problems. But it helps with Descartes if you know what he was trying to do, and I'll come back to that later. Because that he doesn't tell you. The secret of Descartes is his family motto, Laviat Prodor. I think it means he loves to hide. And that's the key to Descartes. And on his tomb it says something like, he who hid well lived well. Or the other way around. So Descartes was a hidden man. So you've got to ask yourself what he was doing. And you need to get into the context of what he was really trying to do. Which, because of circumstances at that time, he felt he needed to keep hidden, as it were. And that actually is a big clue. Really. Anyway, that's interesting. That really is interesting. Let's stop talking about that. Well, that's useful. I mean, I just think it is something we have to be aware of all the time. That things will only get worse. Now, you get some creative insight which really does something new, and it will eventually degenerate into some form which actually stops that very insight happening. That the form which it will turn into will actually inhibit the insight which produced it. There's a marvellous phrase in philosophy used by Etienne Gilles, the historian of medieval philosophy. He said, philosophy buries its own undertakers. That's wonderful. Now, I think I'm not going to do much more on that, because we're all fed up with that. Just to mention that if you follow this through, you can come to see that there can be no such thing as an absolute distinction, because there's always a relation. If you had an absolute distinction, there would be no relation. Therefore, there would be no distinction. So an absolute distinction would commit suicide. It would annihilate itself. That means you cannot have a completely autonomous, independent existence. It's not possible for there to be such a thing. There cannot be something which is completely separate. It must be relationship. Now, when we think about things, because we have this marvellous capacity, which is so wonderful and also so disastrous at the same time, it's an example of Ken Wilbur's good news, bad news. The good news is the bad news, just that you get the good news part of it first as a duck rabbit. The bad news comes later. We have this marvellous ability for abstract thought, which gives us a tremendous ability to do so many things and to live the kind of lives we live, in fact. But abstract thought produces separateness and produces the notion that there are separate autonomous existences, because it abstracts from the whole. It abstracts the difference and leaves the relationship. So it gives us the illusion that there are separate autonomous existences. Now actually, that's all right, so long as you remember Stefan's point, you do this in full awareness. Nobody does. Ever. So consequently, we end up believing that what is fundamental is separate objects, a separate world, the material world, separate, independent, autonomous existences. And then we say, oh good heavens, the world is fragmented into a heap. We don't like this, is atomism. We don't like this. We must put it together. We must become holists. But actually, what we've not seen is that things are already related. There's no such thing as a separate, independent existence. It cannot be in the nature of things. Funnily enough, this is all done right at the beginning of Hegel's work. It's all just ignored usually. But mind you, come on, let's be fair. It doesn't make it easy. There's been a lot said about this, of course, in many, many different contexts. And this means that any entity, whatever it is, although it may seem to exist separately, actually only has its existence as part of a network of relationships. And actually, it is the relationships which are primary, and not more than that which is related thereby. But when we think about this, we think of the world as being made up of separate, independent entities which are like building blocks. And then we say, how are we going to put all this together? And of course, there's been so much said about this with regard to modern physics, because as everybody knows, on and on and on, that when it comes to quantum physics, etc., this idea has had to be given up, and people go on saying, I've come across many people who've said, unfortunately, to see that everything is related, there's no such possibility in Western thinking and so on. Well, it's nonsense. It's actually there all the time. The real problem is actually to see not how things are related together, but to see how things appear to be separate when they're not. That's the real problem. So we're going around saying, how can we relate things, when we ought to be asking the question, how does it come about that things seem to be separate when they're not? And of course, if we then try to say, oh dear me, things are separate, we'd better stick them together, then actually we might be introducing all sorts of connections that don't belong to them at all. Again, you go upstream. I've got a lovely quote here. The attempt to rationally reconstruct the world out of a collocation of bits contingently related to one another is as futile as the attempt to appreciate a symphony by sounding each note in isolation and then imagining a relation between them. And that's what we do. That's it. But we get ourselves into a frightful muddle because we don't ask the fundamental question, how come that which is distinguished but not separate appears to us to be separate and autonomous? So it's the origin of separation that's the real problem, not the wholeness. Once you see that the wholeness is ubiquitous, the wholeness is there, then the problem becomes separation. And that actually does happen in physics. People working in quantum physics come to see that the problem is, how come there can be a domain in which it seems that there are separate entities in classical physics. But there's an awful lot of confusion there. So this, you can begin to approach this by, as it were, reversing the direction of thinking, which will take you back upstream into the coming into being. And then you can actually see how the separateness happens. And then you realise, my God, if I start there, I'm really in a mess, because all I can do is introduce external connections. I like the idea of philosophical work. Henri, the French philosopher, who also does the same kind of thing as what we're doing now, but he does it with regard to time and the present moment and so on. And I'm not working with his work. I know a lot of people who are very interested in the work I do, also the work on Goethe, because they're very interested in Bergson and Deleuze and so on and that. And with Bergson, he's doing exactly the same kind of thing with time and with duration and with experience and so on, but in a different kind of way. And he talks about doing philosophical work. And I like that idea, rather than the idea of philosophy. And he has a phrase, he says, and I've got it next door, I can't read it in French. What it in fact says is that, I've quoted it at the front of the book, but I can't remember it now. What philosophical work does is it reverses the habitual direction of thinking. And that's the whole point for him of doing philosophy. And that's what we have to do here. We have to reverse the habitual direction. And I like the idea of philosophical work rather than philosophy, because it means you're actually doing a certain kind of work, which is what we've been doing here. We're doing philosophical work. We're not, as far as I'm concerned, doing philosophy, because you can do philosophy without doing any philosophical work whatsoever. And many, many people do. Many philosophers don't do any philosophical work at all. They just go on endlessly writing books about philosophy. You can actually also do philosophical work without doing philosophy, which is what Wittgenstein did. Because Wittgenstein took no notice of anything that had gone before him. And he just did it. It's not as true as he'd like to make out. He had a strong cultural awareness because of his cultural background in Austria at that time. And he probably knew more than he let on. But in all his work, he just simply does it. He does not refer to anything else at all or anyone. He actually does it directly. And that's what he did day after day, was philosophical work. He never refers to any philosophers whatsoever. So there you get a case where you have philosophical work without philosophy. There are many, many, many books, wonderful books. Timothy Spriggs, Theories of Existence. What a lovely book. How nicely written. There's no philosophical work in it whatsoever, but it's full of philosophy. So that's the opposite extreme. Most have some kind of combination. So this is the idea that philosophical work is what reverses this habitual direction of thinking. And this is the notion that it takes you back upstream. So you see how what you're faced with came into being. And then you understand it. Does this make sense to you? Right, that's enough of that. In fact, that's more than enough of that. What I propose to do now is, my God, must be mad. I'm going to now do the same kind of thing as we've just been doing, but I'm going to look at the act of seeing. And what we're going to try to do is we try to catch distinction in the act. We're now going to try to catch seeing in the act. And we'll find exactly the same kind of dynamic. And this time, I'm going to give you a rest by showing you a picture. I'm going to give myself a rest as well. This will be fun. Yeah, tar. Thanks so much. This is exciting, isn't it?
Shall we pull the screen down?
Oh, we have a screen.
It's dangerous, it won't come back up again, but we'll try.
There you go.
Flip up the mirror.
That's been said.
All right.
You watch me get completely muddled up. Right. First of all, the most exciting one of all. Well, no point in wasting celluloid.
Oh, yeah.
This is very interesting. It's a cube.
Oh,
No, it isn't. No. But most people, it's a collection of lines. I think there's 12 lines on a flat surface. I think it was 12 lines on a flat surface. That's what it is. There's 12 lines on a flat surface. Many of you looking at it will see a cube straight away. Some of you will see two cubes. Some of you will see one cube and think the person next to you is seeing the same cube, but they're not, they're seeing a different cube.
yeah.
And then some of you will discover that you can actually go from one cube to another cube.
Uh-oh.
Yeah? Anyone who can't?
I get stuck.
I I get
And then all of a
stuck.
sudden it switches over and it's
Yeah.
like,
Oh, there it goes. Just lost.
That's it.
That's one.
That's right. It's very interesting.
Ouch.
It's very interesting. For everyone, there's one way which is easier, natural, and has to make a real effort to get the other way. And just when they've got that, it snaps back again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can practice making it happen. You can practice making yourself go from one to the other, back, one to the other, and so on. It's quite useful to do. This originally, I think, was called the Necker cube, N-E-C-K-E-R. This is an irrelevant piece of information. I'm just filling in time now. It obviously discovered by a man called Necker. You see, he was German, and I think it was actually when people studied crystallography, the microscope and so on. This began to happen to them. They got this Gestalt reversal, as the Germans call it. The word Gestalt for the overall form. And you have one figure with two different overall forms, but the same figure is one whole form or another whole form. It's not that there are two. There's not two here, there's only one. But there's not one, there's two. And no, they're not two, there's only one. What we have here is an ambiguity of one and two. It's very interesting.
Can you show us the triangle? That triangle thing.
No, I'm not going to show a triangle.
Okay.
No, I'm not going
You
to
have
do
it on
that.
the cover of one of the books.
Oh, yeah, but no, I'm not doing that. No.
Okay.
I was lucky to get away with that. I'll tell you a story about that later, but not now. Now, this is very interesting, because you can go from one of these cubes to another. You can actually see it change. As you might say, I can see it change in front of my eyes. But what is changing? It's quite clear that when it changes in front of your eyes, and you say, what is changing? Well, the whole thing changes. I see a different cube. Well, yes, but nothing has changed here. When it changes in front of your eyes, it's not that these lines suddenly rearrange themselves on the screen. And so you see, yes, but I can see the change. And also, there could be half the room can only see one cube, and the other half of the room can only see the other cube. So we can say, well, this is very strange, because we're both looking at what is clearly the same thing. Yet what we're seeing is very different indeed. So it becomes a bit of a puzzle. And then we can say, well, it changes, and it's quite dramatic when it changes, but it doesn't change at all, because nothing changes, yet the whole thing changes. How can it change and not change? We say, well, we say it's there in front of our eyes. It clearly can't be, because nothing changes here, and also, if we accept that some people will see one and not the other, and vice versa, then clearly it can't both be there in front of their eyes, because what they see is different. So then we say, let's try another time. Well, it's not there in front of my eyes. If it's not there, it must be in my head. That's it. The change takes place in my head. That's where it happens. But the fact is, although we loosely talk about this kind of thing, it doesn't take too much to notice that we don't actually see what goes on inside our heads. We don't experience what's inside our heads. What we experience is seeing. And it's no good. We can say, oh, well, yes, but seeing is inside our heads, isn't it? Oh, there is a theory, if ever there was one. You know, because nobody has any experience of seeing inside their heads. Although I've met an awful lot of people who think they have. They're called psychologists, or no, they're not. People who deal with these people, what they call people who do all this stuff on the brain and consciousness. People, whatever they are. They get these people who go on and on about consciousness. Some of these people actually think they experience what's inside their own heads. But then that's what happens to you if you're an academic. You can get very muddled up. Anyway, so where is the change? Well, the answer, obviously, I say obviously, is that the change is not out there, it's not in front of our eyes, it's not in our heads. The change is in the seeing itself. The change takes place in seeing. we're actually here, what we're going to try to do, we're working phenomenologically, we're going to try to describe the experience. And that will sometimes seem strange at first because we have many presuppositions which we bring to things. And if you say, well, the change is in the seeing, your first thought would probably be, well, that doesn't tell me anything. All that does is repeat the problem. I'm seeing it differently. So what does it mean to say the change is in the seeing? So what we have to do is try to catch seeing in the act. This means going upstream from what is seen into the seeing of what is seen, and actually we'll suddenly catch sight of seeing itself. Well, the first thing this tells us is very, very important, which is that we have visual experience is not the same as seeing. Because everyone in this room, let's suppose half the room sees the cube one way and half sees it the other way. Or you yourself, never mind that, you yourself when you switch from one to the other. There's no change in the visual experience. Think of it in that way, the pattern of stimulus coming into your eyes, brain, etc., the pattern of the stimulus, the sensory stimulus is the same. And yet, you see one cube and then you see another cube. So that change, and you see as if it was there, that change is not a sensory stimulus. It's not a visual experience, it's not part of the visual experience. This is quite a shocking thing, we'll come back to this as we go on. It's quite a shocking thing, because we all assume, because of what we've been told and how we've been brought up, that seeing is a visual experience. Seeing is what happens to organisms that have eyes. So if I open my eyes, seeing happens. All this stuff comes in and that's seeing. Well, it can't be, because if that's the case, since that's the same, the stuff that's coming in is the same whether I see it one way or the other, then there's no room in the visual appearance, in the visual experience, which would show me why I could see the whole thing in two different ways, why I could see the whole thing in two different ways. Seeing is more than visual experience. This is something which is surprising. In fact, seeing, it turns out, is an act of perception. It's not something that happens to organisms, it's something that organisms do. But we experience it as if it happened to us. We have the story about sensory stimulus. What this shows us, therefore, is that there's more to seeing than meets the eye. Let's pause there for laughter. There's more to seeing than meets the eye, because what meets the eye is the sensory data, and that's the visual appearance. But that's not the same as seeing, because there are two entirely different cubes can be seen here with the same visual experience, the same visual appearance.
So we happen to it.
Well, let's see.
Instead of it happened to us,
Well,
we happen to it.
let's go along and look at that. We'll follow that up. We'll see. What changes when you go from one to the other? Well, obviously what changes is the overall organisation. The organisation of the whole changes. There's no change to the basic data there. And that means, therefore, that the organisation, which we see, astonishingly, is not a sensory factor. Because we can see two different organisations with exactly the same sensory input. So the organisation of what we see is not a sensory factor. It is therefore a non-sensory factor. We are all having non-sensory experience all the time in the midst of our sense experience, but we're unaware of it. And when we look at this, we say, don't talk such rubbish. It's obviously a sensory factor. I can see it there, for heaven's sake. It's clearly sensory. We're all convinced of that. And yet by introducing this ambiguity here, it enables us, disturbingly, we may not like this, we may feel upset by this, irritated by it. Sometimes we will get angry. There's almost a kind of panic comes over people. Because it's suddenly discovered that seeing isn't what we think it is, and that's disturbing because we're seeing all the time. So this is not necessarily comfortable. I personally find it fascinating, but some people find it very distressing. You have to be careful who you do this with. I know everyone here is sane and well balanced, that's all right. But, yeah, seriously. I found that an astonishing thing, that the organisation is not given with the sense experience. To see a cube at all, let alone to see two cubes in the same place, is to go beyond the sense experience to seeing. Now let's take this further by going to our friend the duck rabbit. There he is. The duck and the rabbit. Cheeky, but a very perky rabbit, this one is. The question is, well, what is the non-sensory factor that organises the visual experience so that sense perception is transformed into seeing? Because that's what happens. The visual experience, which is sense perception, is transformed into seeing, and that's by this non-sensory factor that organises the experience. And it is, in fact, I mean, I'll come on to what this means, it's the idea. It's an idea. And this causes a great deal of trouble, because we think we know what an idea is, and guess what? We get hold of the wrong idea of an idea to begin with. But I say it's an idea. We'll gradually tease this out as we go along. And I call it the organising idea. In this case, you have the rabbit idea or the duck idea. When that idea is active in the perception, then with that peculiar figure, which is just simply a continuous line and a little circle there, you see a duck or you see a rabbit. Quite clear, there's nothing there which is anything like a duck or a rabbit. But my goodness me, as soon as you see it, you say, yes, of course, that's a duck. Oh, that's a rabbit. You see? And that's the idea acting in the perception. Now, the key thing here is, I'm not saying you have the visual experience and you add the idea. You don't have the experience first and then add the idea as if it was something intellectual you add on. If that were the case. There are cases where this does happen. These are people who have brain damage. A lot of work's been done on them. See, these figures are used by the Gestalt psychologists. They worked a lot, Gelb and Goldstein worked a lot with brain damaged people after the First World War, where they actually did have to do what our theories tell us we do, but we don't do. They had to add the idea on separately to make out what the experience was. Now, you didn't have to do that. It was just like that. Because the idea informs the perception. It's in there. It's not something separate which is added. And I call that the organising idea. It's difficult for us to understand because we think of an idea as something which is abstracted from experience. You have experience of chairs, and from it you abstract the idea of a chair. And here we've got the opposite. We've got an idea which is not abstracted from experience, but which is active in experience before the idea which is abstracted from experience. It's there beforehand. It's there in advance, as it were, already informing experience. And that, I would make a distinction here between the primary idea and the secondary idea. The primary idea is the active idea, act-if, active idea, the organising idea in perception. It's active in perception. It's idea in act, hyphenated, idea in act. And that is seeing. But when that acts in the sense perception, sense experience, that is transformed into seeing. Then we have the secondary idea, when we take what is seen, which is what we then focus on. Oh, it's a duck. Oh, it's a rabbit. We don't see the seeing. We take what is seen, and then we abstract an image of that from it. And we say, well, that image is what we mean by an idea. And that's mostly, particularly in the English-speaking tradition, that's what people mean by ideas. Now, certainly there are such ideas, but they're entirely secondary. They're only possible. They're far downstream. They're 2 stages downstream. They're only possible because upstream there's the active idea in perception, acting in perception, which organises the sense experience into seeing. And that's the idea that does that. The idea is the organising factor. Because there, it organises it rabbitly or duckly. Now, Brentano, you will not have heard of Brentano. Franz Brentano, I'll tell you who he was in a minute. I like this very much. It's a big influence on me when I... You know how it is in life, sometimes one sentence just does it for you. It's like a whole lot just crystallises. Like this old crystal, boom, all crystallises. By idea, I mean the act of conceiving, not that which is conceived. It's absolutely wonderful upstream statement, this. It's the act of conceiving. That act is the idea. That's the active idea. It's not that which is conceived. Of course, he knows perfectly well that you can't separate that which is conceived from the act of conceiving. You can't have an act of conceiving that doesn't conceive something. But what he wants to do is to draw attention back from that which is conceived into the conceiving of that which is conceived. And that's what he means by idea, the conceiving, because that's where the idea acts. And I say this I call the organising idea. The idea of the organising idea, instead of which has been found to be quite useful by a number of people. It's been used quite a lot in various areas, because I wrote about this in the Wholeness of Nature. It rather surprised me because even Separateness mentions all this. She likes this in her book, but she doesn't like the word organising. She says that makes it sound too much like something you're doing. She would prefer to use the word ordering, call it an ordering idea. Well, I don't mind, obviously. But I use the word organising because actually I'd actually done all this stuff in the 60s before I came to phenomenology in the 70s. I'm now doing this phenomenologically in terms of this movement of coming into being and so on and that. And the shifting upstream from what is seen into the seeing of what is seen. That's the phenomenological way. So I'm doing it phenomenologically. Actually, I'd done it all in the 60s before, because this is what the later Wittgenstein was doing. Wittgenstein's later work, everyone identifies Wittgenstein with various work on language, but his later work is all on what he calls aspect seeing. This is aspect seeing. Seeing something as, and he really, all his later work is on seeing. And if you look in the later part of the philosophical investigations, which weren't published after his death, the second part is all on seeing. And for a long time, this work, people didn't they didn't do too much on this because they identified Wittgenstein so much with the philosophy of language that it's only more recently people have begun to see how remarkable this work is. Now, ironically, I actually began here because there's a physicist who actually had been with Wittgenstein called Russell Norwood Hanson. He was the one who said there's more to seeing than meets the eye. And he actually introduced this into the philosophy of physics on the question of what is observation and what are facts. In the first two chapters of a book called Patterns of Discovery. The book has another meaning to it actually, it's got a whole polemic and so we needn't go into that. I only ever bothered with the first two chapters. I'm talking now from 1960-61. And that's when I came across this stuff, and that came from Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein's duck rabbit is here. That's Wittgenstein's duck rabbit. That's my duck rabbit. That's the meerkat, that's the market. Well, okay, that's the two compared. Okay, he deals with all this, and he uses the term there that was used, Hansen, was organisation, and that's why he didn't call it the organising idea, but he talks about the organisation changes, and that's why I latched onto the word organisation. Because I've been using that word since 1961. I gave my first talk on this ever in 1961, and here I am today in 2009 still talking about it. I haven't got very far. I've a very quiet life, you know, not a very adventurous life, you know. The first talk I ever gave, the cringe-making title, The Fact Makers. I thought that was very clever, because the idea was that we actually make the facts. Whereas the scientists said the facts are discovered. The fact has an organising idea, so we bring the organising idea to what we believe we discovered empirically from the world. I'll be going to that this afternoon. That's what I was doing in 1961, and here I am doing it here now. Getting out to get a life. Was it too late? Yeah. I just thought it was just so important. Because I realised it changed our whole understanding of so many things. Anyway, we'll come to that later. So that's why I use the term organising idea. But you can use whatever word you want. So the rabbit idea, according to Ventano, the rabbit idea is the act of conceiving the rabbit. That's what the rabbit idea is. Now, we don't think that way. We say, no, the rabbit idea is an image we have in our mind which is abstracted from a rabbit we've experienced. But in order to see a rabbit, you have to have the rabbit idea there to see a rabbit. Before you can abstract from a rabbit what we call the rabbit idea. Do you follow me? There's two ideas here. There's idea one and idea two. And we're confused between them. And I think you're now looking extremely confused. I'm just about going mad. So I think, looking at this, before I go on to the next dramatic development, which is there, I think what I'll do, we'll stop there, because I think this is a very, very good point to stop, seriously, by introducing this. I hope I've built it up enough for you to get a sense of this. And you can now reflect on this and contemplate this between now and 3 o'clock, yes.
I keep thinking of an experience I had a couple of times that I'm not sure if I can explain it, but I was looking up...
Don't explain it, describe it.
I was looking up a subway tunnel. And because of traveling in the subway many times, I had all that information about the tunnel. But what I would see was not a tunnel going like that. I would see something totally different. And then my brain would say, no, it's not that way. It's this way. It would snap and go horizontal again. And I was sure I was losing my mind.
No, you're not losing your mind. But it's very disturbing when this happens to us. Because we get shocks. Because this matters a lot in life. Because sometimes we see something as something directly. And it turns out it was something else. This can be very, very, very dramatic. Yeah, it sounds so. And it can actually cause trouble. People can get killed by making a mistake.
Right.
A lot of this work was done. Well, this work was done in Germany before the war. As I mentioned. And then it was picked up by Wittgenstein, and also picked up in France by Merleau-Ponty, who used this a great deal in his work on phenomenology, in his masterwork, Phenomenology of Perception. And he used particularly, not these things, but the work done by various doctors like Goldstein and so on and that, who were all involved with Gestalt psychology. Both Merleau-Ponty and Wittgenstein both actually thought that the Gestalt psychologists hadn't really understood what they were doing. I'll mention why later. I went further. So it gradually came into the sort of mainstream, and because of the enormous influence of Wittgenstein, eventually people started to look at this, but it's taken an awful long time to come out. And a lot of work then went into it by psychologists in America in the 1950s. And that's because a lot of money was made available by the government to do this. The reason was people were now flying jet planes at very high speeds. It was new. And they would do things like fly a jet plane into a mountain. And they didn't understand why they did this, because the pilot apparently hadn't seen the mountain. And so all this work from psychologists, who are all, like everyone today, is always on the lookout for funding, could say, well, actually, we have something which you think might help to explain these misperceptions and so on. That. So the idea of perception, the psychology of perception, became of great interest to the United States government, the industrial military complex. So a lot of money was made available, and there were jobs for the boys and girls in university to work on this kind of thing. And that brought it out a great deal. But the philosophers had already been using it. And the psychologists in America, they didn't know about this, and they never referred to it, they just didn't know about the phenomenologists and Wittgenstein and so on. But they did a great deal of work on this. There's a very nice book, which is what, actually that was along with the 2 chapters of Hans's book, a book by Abercrombie, Johnson Abercrombie. I've forgotten about that now. It very much influenced me. It was called Anatomy of Judgment. And the first couple of chapters are all on this kind of thing in detail. May still be available. It was in the 50s. And the problem there, he was a medic. And there was a problem of getting students to learn how to read X-ray pictures and some other kind of picture. That kind of thing. Radio something, not radiograms. All the kind of new techniques for picturing things that have come from physics. The problem comes when you look at the pictures, learning to see what is there. And it's very easy to see what isn't there, or to miss what is there. And so again, this whole question of perception became very important. And Johnson Abercrombie gave a course at University College London, I think it was, or nearby there, on this kind of thing to medics, and then wrote this book, The Anatomy of Judgment, with lots of case studies of looking at radiographs or electron microscope pictures or X-ray pictures and so on and that. It's a good book. In fact, Basil Hiley's wife, and this is the time I got interested, I had the book, and he told me his wife was actually teaching a course using Johnson Abercrombie's book. And I think Abercrombie was just around the corner. Those were the days when everything was together. You know, it's amazing. I'll show you a picture from him later. It's very interesting. So, for these kind of reasons, this kind of work on perception became of great interest, and money was put into it. But the philosophers had already been there first, but nobody realised that, except 1 or 2 people like Hansen and so on. And I think it's the philosophers who really brought out the significance of this much more deeply than the people who wanted to use this for practical purposes, because they were interested in the practical purposes. But what it meant was all this kind of stuff became available and came into people's awareness. So you could start using this kind of thing quite naturally and saying this is what people in psychology are doing. And that's when I came in, literally 1960, 61, and started using this stuff. I've forgotten Abercrombie's book. It's just come back to me. How could I have forgotten that? It's because I'm old and my memory's gone. That's why.
Better
Yeah.
than mine.
Hmm?
It's better than mine.
You don't know. I tell you what, when I do this kind of work, I lose my memory for so many things because I have to focus so much. My memory for other things in life just is crazy. When I don't do any work at all, my memory recovers. It's quite interesting. Well, that's it. I suggest we go and have lunch.
Thank you.